Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We're here to discuss a new resource from the Governor's Institute on Community Design called Building Resilient States, Profiles in Action. It is available online, and the URL is on your screen. I want to make sure that everyone knows this webinar is being recorded, as you just heard, and we will make the recording available later this week or early next week online at govinstitute.org. Again, the URL is on your screen. Again, thank you very much for joining. My name is Jerry Mintzer. I'm the Program Manager for the Governor's Institute on Community Design at Smart Growth America. The Governor's Institute is a program that is possible in partnership with Smart Growth America and the Environmental Protection Agency. The Governor's Institute supports governors and state leaders in their work on land use, planning, transportation, resilience, like we're here to talk about today, economic development, and a variety of other topics. As we're discussing this new resource, please, we welcome your comments and your questions. Please type them into the chat box, and we'll have some time at the end of all of our speakers to take questions. You can also tweet your questions using the hashtag #ResilientStates. And we welcome questions throughout the presentation today. Please don't feel like you have to wait till the end. We'll keep track of all of those questions. A little bit about the resource, a little bit of background. Profiles in Action builds off of a resource that was released in 2015 called Building Resilient States, a Framework for Agencies, which outlined a number of steps that states can take to make their states and the communities in them more resilient. This new resource provides case studies for each of the steps outlined in that report. We have a great group of practitioners joining us today whose work is featured in those profiles in this new resource. We have Ian Hyde from the Colorado Resilience and Recovery Office, Rebecca French from the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, Mark Lowry from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. We have Jeanette Dubinin from the Center for Planning Excellence in Louisiana, and also joining us is Harriet Tregoning, the former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development at HUD. And Harriet is going to kick off the panel with a little bit of background and to get the discussion started. So with that, Harriet, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jerry. Welcome to everyone who's on the webinar. Very excited to be talking about this great topic. My overview is really going to be talking about some of the things that many of us know, but I think it's important context for the conversation that we're going to be having today. As many of you are aware, disasters are increasing in number and in repetition, with some places getting hit kind of over and over again. Many of you have probably seen this growth in the number of declared disasters, but what you may not recognize or realize, it doesn't stop at 2010 or 2011. In 2016 alone, we had 2 1-in-1,000-year floods and several 500-year events with 38 federally declared, presidentially declared major disasters, and only 2 of them were named storms, right? Matthew and Helene. Everything else pretty much was simply heavy, heavy rain. And when we talk about repetitive losses, let me just give you a sense of what we're talking about. There were 31 states that got 4 or more major disaster declarations between 2011 and 2015, right? So 10 urban counties had 4 or more of those in that same time period. It is a phenomenon for many of our communities, many of our states, that they're becoming used to disasters. And I know we're going to hear from a couple of those states today, including, I believe, Louisiana. The states aren't uniform, however. So disasters aren't striking the U.S., uniformly all across the nation. And part of the issue is the risk associated with the coast. We've really increased the number of people living on the coast, and that really means that we have more and more population at risk. In 2010, 39% of the U.S. population lived in counties directly on the shoreline, and that's a 40% increase over 1970. And we expect 10 million more to be living on the coast just by 2020. The density is also much, much higher in these communities compared to inland communities, and we now have more than 40 million homes at risk in coastal regions. So what's also striking is what this looks like when you overlay climate change, because the change in population and the coastal risk is something that would increase the risk profile of communities even without a changing climate. When you add rising sea levels and the increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather, you really are talking about something else. Zillow, using data and maps produced by NOAA, created a map and an analysis of sea level rise, and basically found that if sea levels rise as much as climate scientists predict by the year 2100, which is about 80 years from now, almost 300 U.S. cities would lose at least half of their homes, and 36 U.S. cities would be completely lost. 1 in 8 Florida homes would be underwater, accounting for nearly half of the lost housing value nationwide. So, this is something that when you think about a 30-year mortgage, when you think about a century bond for infrastructure, that we'll be experiencing these losses, beginning to experience these losses, way before 2100, and it really affects, how financial institutions are going to begin to think about risk and resilience. I think one of the things that's worth thinking about as we think about what states can do, it's really difficult to focus on resilience if you have to have an individual conversation with every property owner. What would be best is if we thought about this as a opportunity to send better signals to property owners about their risk. And some of the places where you would think those signals are being sent aren't necessarily actually effective at doing so. For insurance premiums, many states basically don't allow risk-adjusted premiums. The state insurance commissions average those insurance premiums across the state. That lowers the cost for the highest risk communities, but it means lower risk insurance policyholders are subsidizing the higher risk ones, and so no one's getting a clear signal. When it comes to federal disaster relief, what's happening there is that we give dollars based on the cost of disaster, but we only get those federal dollars for the most severe disasters. People are pretty much on their own for those non-presidentially declared disasters, and even when you get a federal disaster declaration, the money only goes to the most severely struck communities. When it comes to bond ratings, that's an area where imagine a city that loses half of its real estate value. That really affects the ability to pay back your bonds, but we're not yet seeing any signals sent from Standard & Poor's and other bond rating agencies about those differences. But when they do decide to make those changes, it's going to be devastating for communities that aren't prepared. Similarly, for mortgage lending, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. When it comes to federal flood insurance, you can see by looking at these repetitive loss properties how unevenly distributed the NFIP claims are. It gives you the sense, again, that coastal communities are much more at risk. Although what we saw in 2016 was a lot of flooding, riverine flooding, flooding resulting from heavy rain, and that we expect to become much, much more common. So that suggests that some of the things that we're doing right now with our stormwater systems across the country, in some cases doing so in response to lawsuits related to combined sewer overflows, for those of you in the eastern half of the U.S., that even those settlements and even those requirements that might have been agreed to 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years ago are probably not adequate for the future that we're facing. It's also true that most of the losses are simply not insured, and the gap between insured and uninsured losses continues to grow. And that really puts the burden on states and local governments, as well as on the federal government, to try to compensate people for those losses. And that's another thing where what we do at the federal level with insurance requirements, as well as what we do at the state level in terms of what kind of insurance we require and how much, could make a real difference in terms of preparing an individual property owners for the future that we're facing. Many of you who are on the phone are deeply experienced in disaster, and you know that the federal funds that come don't come to everybody that's struck by a disaster. But even when that money comes to your jurisdiction, it's a mixed blessing. When Hurricane Katrina hit, it was an incredibly expensive disaster. But let's look for a second at Hurricane Sandy. This chart really shows you that the Sandy appropriation at nearly $50 billion exceeded the entire annual budget of dozens of agencies, and this is just some examples, bigger than double the size of the annual NASA budget, bigger than the Department of State's budget, Justice, Energy, et cetera. And if you think about what states and local governments receive, sometimes they're getting an appropriation that is 100 times what they are typically manage on an annual basis in terms of a community development block grant. And that brings enormous challenges in terms of managing that quantity of money. And what you need to do to respond to a disaster is often very different than how you might manage an economic development program or a housing program. So it creates a lot of difficulties to even do it the way that we're doing it. And preparedness includes figuring out how your agencies, your state agencies, are going to handle and be prepared for that big influx of funding if and when it comes in the wake of a disaster. When we're talking about real estate, as I mentioned, that Zillow showed that a lot of properties could end up being affected. And for some, analysts predict that the economic effect of a collapse in the waterfront property market could easily surpass the dot-com and real estate bubbles of 2000 and 2008. So just think about that in coastal communities in particular, what it would mean when the first lender said, I can't issue a 30-year mortgage for that property, and how that would ripple through a community, what that would do, what kind of panic buying and selling that might start. So I think that at the state level in particular, as well as at the local level, we really have to think about our resilience also in terms of what happens when markets and our financial institutions start to lose confidence in the safety of properties in certain locations, and how we start to think about that now so as to not be in that situation. What we do to make our communities more resilient has a huge impact on both the money that's available as well as the kind of public support that might exist for spending that money or finding that money. I sometimes make the point that if you were to, this is a kind of a mock-up of Lower Manhattan, that if you were to ask New Yorkers or the city government, what would protect from the next Superstorm Sandy, a seawall would be an obvious answer, and that every one of our communities has that kind of answer kind of at the ready. But you have to ask yourself why you would ever build something like this, a berm or a levee, if a series of waterfront parks could provide the same level of storm protection and every single day provide an amenity to communities. These are illustrations of a project that was called the Big U, that's now called the Dry Line, that got Sandy disaster recovery funding from the federal government to do exactly that, to build parks and amenities that also provide that kind of storm surge protection in different Lower Manhattan neighborhoods based on the character of those neighborhoods. Those are things that provide great amenities for communities, helped with their revitalization, but at the same time provided that vital protection. And imagine the kind of support that a state would have, that a local government would have for this, versus something like this. So when it comes to funding, one of the things that's true, we're looking at federal dollars as something like, 100 billion out of 400 billion that's spent annually on infrastructure. The other 3/4 is coming from states and local governments. So all of you on the phone have projects that you are already funding in your state or local capital improvement plan. It might be a road widening. It might be a park project. It might be some other kind of very typical infrastructure project. The best place to find the money is out of the places where you are already spending. The incremental cost of adding resilience, of adding stormwater management features is a fraction, a small fraction of what it costs to do an independent project. And so one of the things that we've been doing is working with the Center for Planning Excellence in Louisiana. We'll maybe hear a little bit about this later, and others around the country to help local governments mine their CIPs to see what projects they can amend, that they could slightly redesign in order to provide these resilience benefits, knowing that the majority of the funding for these projects already exists in those budgets. And states can play a huge role either through hazard mitigation grants or even in how they allocate money for disaster recovery by partnering with local governments, maybe topping off those local CIPs in order to find that money, to leverage that money and align those local, state, and federal interests in resilience. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian to give us a deeper dive into some of the specifics. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Harriet, for setting the stage with a lot of that great information. I am here to talk a little bit about our experience in the state of Colorado in building a statewide resilience framework and trying to build that in the context of recent record disasters. What I'd like to do is start with just a brief description within the Smart Growth Guide, and even before that, I'd like to say thank you so much to Smart Growth America for putting together this wonderful resource. I know that our state is going to benefit a lot from learning from the other examples that are in there. The feature on Colorado focuses on establishing an executive office. And to give you just a bit of background about who the Colorado Resiliency and Recovery Office is, we were established in September of 2013, 2 days after record flooding, to ensure that Governor Hickenlooper had a daily eye on what was going on with the floods to partner with our great departments across state government, to really keep a sense of urgency throughout the flood recovery process, which was the biggest disaster in our state history. So as a part of the governor's office, we coordinate efforts with our partners at the state and local level, set priorities, and we also provide guidance to Colorado and its communities to focus on how we build resilience for the long term. It's always important to have a conversation about resilience by taking into context who we are as a state. In Colorado, we are a very geographically, economically, and culturally diverse state. I believe we are the 8th biggest state in the country with 104,185 square miles. We also have very interesting topography, something that I'm sure draws many folks to come and visit Colorado for its natural beauty, but it does present some challenges in terms of disasters as well. It's also important to note that we are both a very urban and a very rural state. 86% of Coloradans live in urban areas, while 98% of the state geographically is considered rural. Finally, we are a home rule state, which means that a lot of the responsibility and onus for land use and other considerations are at the local level, and the state is here to provide that support, guidance, and partnership. We have had a number of record disasters in the last few years. In 2012 and 2013, we had record wildfires, followed in September of 2013 by the record 2013 floods. In between those disasters, we were also experiencing post-wildfire flooding and debris flows. In total, we estimate that about 3,000 homes were lost, about $5 billion in impact to housing, infrastructure, watersheds, and the economy. And most important about all of that is the thousands of lives that were changed as a result of those disasters. While we were in the process of implementing our recovery process, we initiated a conversation about what resilience means for the state of Colorado. One of the first things we needed to do was to understand why we were having the conversation. In Colorado, resilience matters, first of all, because history tells us that Colorado is not immune to disasters. It's a matter of when, not if, they'll happen again. We also know that population is growing and growing fast. Our Department of Local Affairs estimates that the state will grow about 50% in the next 30 to 40 years. In addition, we know that climate is changing, and that acts as a bit of a consequence or a force multiplier when you take into consideration disasters such as floods, wildfires, droughts. Also, an important point that Harriet was making is there is more responsibility on states and local communities to address those disasters beforehand, and the federal government may not provide as much resources as it has in the past. So we need to think creatively about how we can buy down our risk. So all of this led to a year-long conversation, which led to the development and the adoption of the Colorado Resiliency Framework. Governor Hickenlooper adopted that framework in May of 2015. What you see on the screen right now is the definition that our state, federal, and local team put together. We looked at a lot of the literature out there about resilience, but we also wanted to create a very strong value statement that guided the actions that we take, and thus that's what you see on the screen. An important part of the framework is that it is integrated and interdisciplinary. We have about 27 agencies who actively participated in the development of our framework. Coming out of the framework, the governor formalized our Colorado Resiliency Working Group, an interagency team really charged with leading and implementing this framework. There continues to be 17 agencies that are actively involved in implementing the framework today. It's based around 6 core interdependent resiliency sectors. We had different agencies who led those sector groups and developed actions within the framework of their discipline, but also thinking about how they relate to those various other sectors included in our framework. As I mentioned, Governor Hickenlooper adopted the framework in May of 2015. We are now in the process of implementing the framework. It was really built around the notion that this is something that we need to implement on a daily, monthly, and a yearly basis. As a part of that, our state team, the Colorado Resiliency Working Group, develops an annual implementation plan each year that we publish on our Colorado United website. and we just completed our first year of implementation in the framework. We've really seen our actions and our priorities go into three key areas. The first is building capacity and empowering a culture of resilience across the state. That means that we understand what it is that we're talking about when we say resilience. It means that we have a coordinated approach to implementation and that we're really empowering our local governments, nonprofit organizations, businesses, individual Coloradans to act on resilience. Another piece is we want to have a really data-driven effort. We want to understand what our risk is today and how that might change over time. So we're investing in both developing data, but then using that to guide our actions. In the third piece, and another point that Harriet made so well, is we need to think about those investments that we're already making and how we can integrate resilience into those investments. So I just want to go through a few of the actions that we have taken thus far in our first year of implementation. The first was the development of the Co-Resiliency Resource Center. It's an online interactive hub that our office put together at coresiliency.com. It explains what we mean by resilience, provides some education on the fundamental aspects of resilience, and then it moves into guidance on communities who may want to develop a resiliency framework, but also how you integrate resilience into your planning and into your investments, whether that's capital improvement plans, comprehensive plans, or otherwise. Coming very soon are going to be profiles in resilience action, case studies, where we talk about what's been done successfully and what could be done moving forward. Another key effort in our 2016 implementation plan was the implementation of the Colorado Hazard Mapping Program. Our state legislature allocated about $7 million to update floodplain maps in our flood-impacted areas, but also to modernize flood maps in 28 counties that still had paper maps from the 1970s and 80s. But we understand that it's not just rivers flowing downhill. They move side to side. They erode. There are debris flows. And so that allocation included funding for debris flow mapping in high-risk, high-consequence areas, as well as developing a methodology for erosion zones. We will have in the next year pilot communities who will actually develop erosion zone maps to guide some of their future actions. Another important effort in 2016 was the development of the Planning for Hazards Guide, which you can find at planningforhazards.com. This project was led by our Colorado Department of Local Affairs. It includes guidance on hazard identification and risk assessment. Going back to Colorado being home rule, it includes a flexible set of land use tools that will enhance community-based mitigation efforts, actually building that into development practices. But communities can use those in the context of their priorities and their vision. And as such, it is very adaptable to different community contexts. Again, that's at planningforhazards.com. Finally, just talking about what's next in 2017, we're going to be taking a long, hard look at how we integrate resilience criteria into the state's funding and asset management practices. Really trying to institutionalize this effort for the long term so that it continues long after I'm here or other state team members are here, anybody involved in this effort. We also want to continue to capture those best practices, codes, and standards and support local efforts. So please stay tuned to coloradounited.com to find out more. And I'll leave my contact information up for just a second. Anybody on this webinar is free to contact our office. And with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca French with the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation.
Thank you so much, Ian. I really have learned a lot from the state of Colorado. Been following your work, I think, since the first Rockefeller workshops related to the National Disaster Resilience Competition. So thanks so much for the lessons learned that you've already been sharing with the state of Connecticut. So I will be talking about the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for this institute. We are based at the University of Connecticut, but we are a partnership with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. We were created a little over 2 years ago. We have a small staff, but we bring in faculty expertise from across the university. as well as the practical experience of the Connecticut DEP. Our mission is to increase the resilience and sustainability of vulnerable communities in Connecticut's coastal and inland areas to severe storms and the growing impacts of climate change on the natural built and human environment in response to critical identified needs and priorities. This mission statement really reflects the values of who was behind creating this institute. We were really a post-Sandy, post-Irene institute of really recognition on both the part of the state legislature as well as Governor Malloy's administration that more resources needed to be provided to Connecticut's communities to help them understand the risks that they face with the change in climate as well as extreme weather, and solutions. So those critical identified needs and priorities are really those identified by communities. Also hence the creation of my position within the Institute, that the creators decided that we really need someone 100% dedicated to making sure that there was a strong relationship between the research, projects and programs, and the needs of communities. And I think this is already highlighted by the Smart Growth America report, but just so you know, those legislative efforts that preceded the creation of this institute, there was a shoreline preservation task force that was led by the chair of the Environment Committee in our House legislature, and that task force had many recommendations for helping coastal communities deal with recovery after Sandy, but they also called for, again, more resources and science-based resources. There was a Public Act 13-179 that passed that called for the creation of a Connecticut Center for Coast based out of Yukon. And again, the Malloy administration, particularly the Commissioner of DEP at that time, Commissioner Dan Esty, and the Vice Provost at Yukon got together and realized that we could help bring those resources together through a partnership between Yukon and DEEP. We set up the Institute to again have that close relationship between municipalities as well as state agencies. And our executive steering committee is made up of half DEEP staff and half Yukon faculty, again to bring in both those resources. It's co-chaired by the Commissioner of the DEP and the Vice President for Research at the University of Connecticut. We also have an advisory committee that brings in partners from federal agencies, nonprofits, foundations, environmental NGOs, the private sector, particularly water and energy utilities, as well as other academic centers from around the state. So that was really our overall strategy. These are all the stakeholders that are involved in CIRCA projects and programs every day. We divided up our programs into 3 areas. We have ongoing research projects funded both by our sort of startup funds. We also send funding out. We have 2 external grants programs. We have a municipal resilience grants program that has funded 13 grants to date in towns in Connecticut as well as councils of government. Council of Government is a regional planning organization in our state. We do not have county government in Connecticut, so we included our regional planning organizations because they're the closest proxy that we have to regional government, and they work very closely with towns. Of course, their governing body is made up of the elected officials from the towns within their jurisdiction. We also have a matching funds program, which was set up to leverage our relatively small budget to help organizations, including academic, nonprofit partners, towns, to be the match when they're applying for other federal or foundation programs. You know, many programs like FEMA or Sea Grant require a 25% match, and so communities and organizations can apply to us to fulfill that match requirement. That's often a barrier to getting additional funding to implement projects around resilience and climate adaptation. And we also have a community engagement program led by myself where we speak regularly in towns, host webinars. We have a website and a newsletter, so we're regularly communicating what we're doing as well as regularly receiving input into the programs of the Institute. What we do, these are the areas that we're covering. Again, I mentioned that CIRCA, it's our acronym CIRCA, was really a post-Sandy, post-Irene, which really had a lot of damage from flooding and waves. And so because, again, we were focused on the needs and priorities identified by towns, and the towns were influenced by the experience they had just had with these storms, we've been focused on largely on flooding impacts and then sort of the downstream impacts from flooding. So we have science and engineering work on sea level rise, coastal flooding and waves, as well as inland flooding, upland and riverine flooding. But we also look at the impacts of flooding on critical infrastructure like wastewater treatment plants and drinking water systems, roads. But we also look at solutions like living shorelines, which some of you may know that more as green infrastructure or nature-based infrastructure or natural solutions. It's going by many names these days, but living shorelines for us is an alternative to seawalls. And I think Harriet Tregoning also already highlighted why you might see multiple benefits from that kind of approach as opposed to building a seawall. And we also do a fair amount of work on policy and planning, partnering with towns, developing model ordinances for them, as well as reviewing state policy and advising state agencies. So because I can't cover all of the research projects we have, we have 15 research projects going right now, funded both by our startup funds as well as external grants that our faculty have competed for at the federal level and received funding to do. So one of these projects funded by our initial startup funds is to develop models that allow us to extrapolate sea level flooding to the centers of cities and headwaters of marshes. When Connecticut has a highly variable coast, is very heterogeneous, and our centers of our cities and assets are in areas that are not right at the water's edge always. And so we want to understand what the flood risk will be where the most vulnerable and most valued property and assets are located. We can also use the same modeling approach with waves, and this allows us, waves information is really important for designing coastal erosion protection and alternatives like living shorelines. You want to understand what wave heights and wave energy will be in those areas where you're designing. And this is some work we've actually already completed funded by NOAA, and you can find wave data from our models for Long Island Sound on our website, which is circa.uconn.edu. Our Municipal Resilience Grants Program, a little bit more about that. This program provides funds for municipal governments and councils of governments for initiatives that advance resilience, including the creation of conceptual design, construction, demonstration projects, or other structures, or the design of practices and policies that increase their resilience to climate change and severe weather. Proposals that must develop knowledge or experience that is transferable to multiple locations in Connecticut. Basically, we're a small organization with a small budget relative to the size of this problem. Again, you've got a pretty good idea of the size and scope of this issue already from the previous speakers. So we can only pilot a few things here and there, but we want them to get at the heart of some of the big issues facing Connecticut so that we can share lessons learned through our community engagement program. An example from this grant program is a grant that was awarded to the towns of Oxford and Seymour. These towns regularly experience riverine flooding, and they applied to us for funding for planning for flood resilient and fish-friendly road stream crossings in the southern Naugatuck Valley. They're assessing road stream crossings to identify undersized structures, looking at current and future climate conditions. They're collaborating with our faculty in Civil and Environmental Engineering Department to model the flood flows, peak flows, and flood volumes they might experience. And they're going to develop a road stream crossing inventory and a management plan. We have a lot of small rivers and streams all across our state, so the knowledge developed from this project should be transferable to many locations. Our Matching Funds program, again, leverages our budget to match other grants. We awarded a matching fund to Dr. Jennifer Mattei, who's a professor of biology at Sacred Heart University. She's the project lead on an installation of living breakwaters at Stratford Point in Stratford, Connecticut. This is a coastal community. The matching funds matched a grant from Audubon, Connecticut, and that runs the U.S. Army Corps in Lieu Fee program for marsh mitigation banking, and a grant from the Long Island Sound Futures Fund, which provides funds for projects that increase the health and resilience of Long Island Sound. And these pictures are a before and after shot of the site where the living breakwaters were installed. You can see in sort of the upper left-hand corner that there was a lot of marsh in this area, but it's been highly degraded and removed. This whole area look at was at one point covered in a healthy several feet of marsh. But it's been highly eroded from wave action here, as well as some remediation. This has actually happened to also be a brownfield site. So there was also some purposeful disturbance of the soils for remediation purposes. They've been trying for many years to reestablish a natural shoreline here, but couldn't really get ahead of the natural wave action and increasing erosion. So they installed these reef balls that are acting as a breakwater to slow down those waves and dissipate them before they hit the shoreline. And then you can see in the background where they've replanted a marsh. And the reef balls aren't just any kind of hard structure. They are spaced so that critters can move between the water and the shoreline and keep the ecosystem benefits of this area. That's especially important because this is both a horseshoe crab site as well as a flyway for birds, and that's what's protected by Audubon for that purpose. These reef balls can also act as a substrate for shellfish growth. And finally, our community engagement program. Again, I drive all across the state of Connecticut, but we're a small state, so that's actually possible. I'm talking to communities, but I also work a lot with state agencies. And we helped the state of Connecticut apply for the National Disaster Resilience Competition and develop a resilience vision in that process. And so I want to note all of the state agencies that we partnered with on that effort, as well as the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities that represents most of our towns in the state, and colleagues at the Yale University because they have an excellent architecture program there and it complements the strength in marine sciences and coastal flood modeling that we have at the University of Connecticut. And of course, the Office of the Governor was instrumental in this effort. And I'm happy to say that Connecticut was selected as one of the winners of this competition, and the implementation of this vision I'm showing here, which really takes advantage of Connecticut's high ridge lines that extend all the way out to the coast. That's just a feature of our underlying geology. But we also have low-lying coastal communities in between. So the strategy is to adapt and connect those communities to these high ridgelines, and then in the long term invest in resilient transit-oriented development around our economic resilience engine, which is the train line running along the coastline between New York City and our coastal cities and towns. With that, I'd just like to thank Smart Growth America for featuring what we've been doing at Circa, and encourage everyone to join us on our website at circa.uconn.edu. You can find out more about all of our projects there. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark Lowery. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to Smart Growth America for the invitation to participate in today's webinar. Just by way of introduction, I am one of 8 staff members with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's Office of Climate Change. The Office of Climate Change has been around for about 10 years, and our responsibility is to coordinate New York State's response to climate change, both in terms of mitigation of emissions and adaptation to the effects of climate change. And we also have a very effective firewall that prevents me from advancing the slides, so you'll be hearing me say next from time to time. I've been asked by Smart Growth America to review in just a few moments DEC's implementation of the New York State Community Risk and Resiliency Act. And CARA, as we call it, CRRA, is all about mainstreaming climate change considerations into routine decision-making here at DEC and at other New York State agencies as well. Next, please. CARA has 5 major provisions. I'm going to be talking about the second and third in a little more detail in the next several minutes, but I'll just mention in passing the first, fourth, and fifth. The first is that CARA required DEC to promulgate a regulation that adopted official state sea level rise projections. And the department has done that. We have had, in effect since February 2017, a regulation that adopts science-based sea level rise projections for the entire tidal coast of New York State. Those projections include 5 sea level rise scenarios, include projections of up to 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. The fourth and fifth provision is that CARA required the Department of State, in consultation with the Department of Environmental Conservation, to develop model local laws. These would be local laws that municipalities in New York State, which have home rule, could adopt to enhance their local resiliency. And further, DEC, in consultation with the Department of State, was required by the law to develop guidance on the use of natural resources and nature-based features to enhance resiliency. And both of those documents are in progress, and we hope to have them out for public review before the end of 2017. Next, please. Oh, I'm sorry. No, not yet. I knew this was going to throw off my timing. Can you go back? I'm sorry. So perhaps the most significant provision of CARA is that applicants in a number of specified permitting and funding programs are required to demonstrate that they have considered sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding in their project design. And DEC, in consultation with the Department of State, is required to develop guidance on implementation. And I'll talk about how we are interpreting that requirement in a few moments. And also, the Act amends what in New York State is called the Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act to require consideration of mitigation of those same climate change hazards, sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding in public infrastructure smart growth assessments. And again, I'll go into that in a little more detail in a moment. So getting back to the second, the specified permit programs that are covered by CARA. Next slide, please. I just put these up. I won't go through all these other than to mention, I guess the more important point to mention is the limited scope of this act. It is not a wide sweeping requirement that climate change, sea level rise, and flooding be considered in all permit or regulatory decisions by DEC or any other state agency. Rather, its scope is limited to the permits that you see here that are all issued by DEC. And further, it only applies to permits issued for major projects in New York State, in what we call the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act, or mini NEPA. There's a differentiation between major and minor projects, and again, CARA only applies to major projects. Most significant probably will be the effect on the Protection of Waters Act, which is the authority, grants DEC authority to regulate stream bed disturbance and things like transportation infrastructure, bridges, and culverts, which are placed in the stream beds, the 2 wetlands programs, and also our CHOP program will probably, by the time this is all over, be the programs that are most affected. It's also worth noting that CARA does not amend the New York State Building Code, nor does it require the Department of State, which in New York is responsible for the New York State Building Code, to amend the building code to accommodate future flooding beyond the current requirements, nor does it amend that seeker, mini NEPA here in New York State, nor finally does it does not require that local municipalities amend any of their local laws or codes. Next, please. As I mentioned, there are a number of funding programs that are also covered. Not all of these are managed by DEC. Most significant of these will be the State Water Pollution Control Revolving Fund and the State Drinking Water Revolving Fund, under which the New York State distributes funding to municipalities for new water infrastructure and upgrade to water infrastructure. And then the Department of State's Local Waterfront Revitalization Program applicants, these are going to be municipal applicants in this program, would also be required to show how their LWRPs, their local waterfront revitalization plans, will consider sea level rise and flooding. Next, please. One of the challenges that CARA presented to us was that it does not, even though it addresses about 20 different programs, it does not did not amend the authorizing statutes for any one of those programs, but required DEC to develop implementation guidance. And so our approach has been to draft what we are calling the New York State Flood Risk Management Guidance, which is essentially guidance to the agencies that are responsible for implementing each of the 20 or so programs that are covered, and give recommended guidelines for flood risk management, with the idea that each of those responsible programs, whether it's a division within DEC or another agency, would incorporate the guidelines of the flood risk management guidance into its program-specific guidance or its regulations as it's authorized to do by the specific enabling legislation that guides its program. And the reason we felt we had to do it this way is that when you look across the spectrum of enabling statutes, I should say, for the various programs covered by CARA, the agencies had there was quite a variation in the authority that an agency would have in requiring an applicant to actually incorporate future climate conditions into the applicant's project design. So again, we are drafting this as our implementation guidance as required by CARA, this flood risk management guidance. This is currently undergoing internal review with the intent of releasing it hopefully in the next few weeks for public review, and it will be made available for the general public in New York State to review for at least 45 days. Next, please. Just to give you an idea of what is in this flood risk management guidance, it is built around three general flood risk management guidelines. If you are familiar with Obama's Executive Order 13690, these will look somewhat familiar to you. The general guidelines essentially consist of the base flood elevation, plus a freeboard requirement, with that elevation being horizontally extended till it intersects with the ground. So an attempt to capture those floodplain fringe areas and bring them under some potential regulation or at least guidance on reducing flood losses in those fringe areas, the 500-year flood area, or again, if you're familiar with 13690, you're familiar with the term climate-informed science approach. 13690 does not describe exactly what it means by the climate-informed science approach. Much of our flood risk management guidance is devoted to describing how, in a particular situation, given a particular structure type, an applicant would calculate what the guideline elevation would be, considering either sea level rise or projected enhanced flows in riverine environments here in New York. And there is guidance on how we expect that to be done. All of this is intended to essentially replace what in New York and most other places is the standard regulatory line, that being the 1% flood, the annual chance floodplain as mapped on a FEMA firm. So looking for regulatory replacements for that 1% line is the entire idea of this flood risk management guidance. Next, please. Another guidance document that we hope to have out in the next several weeks is Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Project Assessment Guidance. In New York State enacted in 2010 the Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act, which requires any New York State agency that funds, undertakes, or approves a public infrastructure project to consider 10 criteria, smart growth criteria, which were based on work done by Smart Growth America. CARA adds an 11th criterion, which is the mitigation of sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. And to implement this, we have added a question, or we've developed guidance to these public infrastructure agencies as to how they should go about incorporating consideration of flooding, et cetera, into their agency smart growth assessments. And in New York, most New York State grants to municipalities and NGOs are distributed through what's called the consolidated funding application. It's essentially a portal for entities to apply for state funds, and for projects that are related to public infrastructure, we've now added the question, will the proposed project mitigate future climate risk, blah, 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 with the idea of forcing applicants to describe how they are considering sea level rise and flooding in their project designs for which they're requesting state funds. And I believe next, and my contact information, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Oh, and I'm sorry, thank you. And I'm to hand it over to Jeanette Dubinin.
Thank you so much. I am very excited to be on this webinar. Thank you for the invitation and to be able to feature some of the work that we've done that are also a part of the case study in the Building Resilient States and Profiles and Action document. A little bit about so the document that I'm going to be talking about is the Best Practices Manual for Development in Coastal Louisiana, which is included as a case study. And I want to tell you a little bit about the Center for Planning Excellence first and how this document came about. We are a membership-based planning organization in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and we focus on making every community extraordinary through visionary planning. In that sense, we help our communities create great neighborhoods and quality places, transportation choices, resilience, focus on resiliency, and assist with civic education and engagement. In short, we bring people, culture, and planning together to make great places and not just anywhere USA. In this capacity, we have worked with more than 30 parishes, so there are counties, and communities in Louisiana. Many of these communities that we work with face a similar risk, and that is flooding and the subsequent damage that comes with it. A lot of the flood damage can be avoided if local governments have informed land use and development regulations in place, which many of them do not. Through this work and with our communities, we've created resources that assist the communities in their efforts to develop, redevelop, and address the challenges related to living near and with the water. All of them can be found on our website, cpex.org. One of the documents that we've developed about 6 years ago is the Best Practices Manual and its companion, the Coastal Louisiana Land Use Toolkit, because developing and growing as a community on a delta brings about its own challenges. As with all CPEC projects, this was developed with a significant amount of community input from beginning to end of the project. The Mississippi River Delta, which Louisiana is part of, shares many of the same characteristics with other deltas. And so the first thing we did that is also documented in the manual is to look at best development practices that are successful in similar environments. You can see here one example from the Netherlands. We're using a layered approach of looking at the land and the water use, the natural layer and infrastructure. We applied this approach to understand our own state, Louisiana. So we took a closer look at Louisiana's land development patterns. We looked at our economies, like for instance the oil and gas industry, which provides 1/5 of the nation's crude oil refining capacity, and also the seafood industry, which for instance provides 70% of all oysters that are consumed in the U.S. And of course our environment. We are surrounded by rivers, estuaries, swamps, bayous, lakes, and the Gulf of Mexico. So to highlight the variations of the natural layers throughout the coastal region, and specifically in Louisiana, we developed geotypes. The geotype, which you can see on this slide, is a diagram that shows how the natural layer drives the land and water use and infrastructure development. Understanding the geotype helps planners and decision makers understand how the natural layer will affect land use and development. On the top left, you can see an image that shows the coastal region of Louisiana, the boot, and the different colors show the 6 different geotypes we were able to identify based on the layered approach. This is one in the southwest. Here's one along the Atchafalaya. Here is along the riverbanks, the Mississippi River. And then in our coastal areas, and you can definitely see how land development patterns are different. This matrix highlights how the geotypes can so using these geotypes, we can make decisions to apply the best practices to sustain the economy and community and lower current and future flood risk. The matrix you're looking at prioritizes the best practices that are also highlighted in the manual at the community and the site and building scale according to each geotype. So an example of a best practice that is essential to all geotypes is the creation of community-driven resiliency plans. And another one is concentrating development in areas that are not prone to flooding. The dark orange you see on the left picture represents the high flood risk. And on the second image, you can see how development is encouraged in an area with lower flood risk. So we include hazard mitigation and strategic site development based on our efforts into comprehensive planning. While the manual lays out what can be done, we also felt it was necessary to include a how, and this is why we developed the Coastal Toolkit, which provides the regulatory language to implement the strategies and best practices highlighted in the manual. For instance, to manage stormwater better, we provide ordinances that require stormwater to be handled on site. Other model ordinances include water storage, open space, infiltration, and site and building design requirements. There are many, many more that you can see in the manual and the toolkit on our website at cpex.org. And then finally, through this work and working with our communities, helping them plan and implement and utilizing the resources we and others have created, we learned a few things. First, progress is slow, but repetitive information is helpful, very helpful. Most of the planning and implementation efforts and the adoption of regulatory standards is a reaction to a need that existed, for instance, like flooding. But in order to be reactive and implement the regulations, they need to be available. So this is where we come in. And then oftentimes, because they're reactive, not all the available tools are used, but only the ones that fill the need. So what we really focus on now is to provide resources to our communities that can be implemented or used cafeteria style. And we need to make sure that the involvement of our stakeholders is always at the forefront of developing any kind of resources because they know best. So with that, I wanted to thank you for being part of this webinar, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me via email or by phone or browse our website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, and I want to give a big thank you to you as well as to Harriet and Mark and Rebecca and Ian for joining us today and all of our participants listening. At this point, we're gonna take a few minutes. We're gonna go over a little bit to answer a few questions. If you haven't gotten a chance to type in your question, please do so now. We'll try to squeeze a few in. And just a reminder that this resource is available online right now, and then we'll have a recording of this webinar available as well. We did get one great question from Eric, which was that there was lots of discussion today about flooding, but are you looking at an all hazards approach that goes beyond flooding and climate adaptation? If one or two folks on our panel would like to give a fairly brief answer to Eric, just since we have Was there anyone who wanted to take Eric's question?
Sure.
Yeah, this is Mark.
So it sounds
go ahead,
like
Ian.
Ian and Mark both have responses. We'll just go Ian and then Mark.
Sure. I'll just take this very quickly. With our resiliency framework and our overall efforts, we do consider all hazards that could impact Colorado: floods, wildfires, droughts, geologic hazards. But we also consider the intersection between those hazards and underlying stresses like economic diversity, available, affordable housing, employment, mental health, other considerations. So it's really about all hazards, but also the intersection with those stresses.
And Mark from New York, I'll just say that the Community Risk and Resiliency Act that I was talking about only specifies sea level rise and flooding, but we are working with the New York State Department of Health to develop strategies to help municipalities and local governments, primarily counties in New York, to deal with extreme heat, which is the other major hazard that we're concerned about here in New York.
Thanks very much. And we've got one other question from Elizabeth, specifically about some of the projects that were talked about and if they address the Americans with Disabilities Act at all. If anyone's able to answer that. I know that many of our presenters shared their contact information, so if we don't have an answer right now, I'm sure, Elizabeth, you can follow up with some of our presenters after the fact.
This is Rebecca from Circa. I can speak to that a little bit. I don't think we dealt with that specifically, but certainly as part of our discussions with towns-wide discussions and now policy work we're having happen, there are concerns about elevating homes and accessibility issues related to that. We have many coastal homeowners who are retiring to homes and then elevating their homes, and walking up an extra set of stairs is a real concern. So it's definitely something that's being thought about in the state, and something that we're aware of, that there's some challenges.
Thanks, Rebecca. And we've gotten a couple questions or comments throughout the webinar just about folks wanting to contact you all. So I'll be sure to share contact information for all of you with the recording that's being posted. I know Dean wanted to get in touch with the Colorado Resilience and Recovery Office. We'll make sure that we make that happen. But that is just about all the time we have today. Thank you all for staying with us a little bit past 2 to hear from all of our speakers and answer your questions. Again, our report is available to read more about the great work that these folks are doing on the ground. And again, thank you all for participating, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks again.